Welcome back to Takacs McGinnis. I'm Barbara McGinnis, and in today's episode we're talking about clinical research trials and developments.
And I'm Tim Takacs, and in this segment we are talking with Dr. David Hutchings. And Dr. Hutchings specializes in neuropathology and dementia. Welcome, David. Thanks for being here.
Having me. Thank you.
You are a neuropathologist. Okay, What is that, and how does it help your clients or your patients?
Neuropathology is a branch of medicine that specializes in disorders of the nervous system. And dementia and all forms of dementia certainly fall into that category. It gives us a much more complex and comprehensive look into our patients through evaluation, treatment, differential diagnosis, and especially symptom management, but also working with the caregivers as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, sounds like you're an overachiever as well. You're also a speech-language pathologist.
Yes,
so if you'll explain what that is
Sure.
and how that helps your clients.
Means a lot of student loans. Exactly. So speech pathology or speech language pathology in the field of geriatrics really complements what I do in neuropathology in my treatment for dementia patients. And if you look at what a speech language pathologist does, you can kind of break it into three major categories. Number one, they treat swallowing disorders. Number two, they treat cognitive and memory issues and impairments. And number three, they also work with patients who have difficulty communicating either verbally or non-verbally. And if we look at that in the dementia population, we see all three of those realms of impairments in our progressive patients.
Sure.
All right, and so you mentioned swallowing.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
And I'm having trouble connecting neuropathology and swallowing.
Yeah.
Can you help
a lot
our
of people
viewers?
do. I think it's a great question. You know, when we think about dementia, most people think about memory. And by definition, we would say dementia is a complete deterioration of all mental and physical functions. And what happens is dementia begins to progress, patients lose the ability to swallow. And that's why we see so many of our elderly patients, and especially our dementia patients, acquire pneumonia. And they'll have some odd symptoms too. They'll have maybe runny noses and watery eyes when they eat. And those are all symptoms that things are actually getting in your lungs. We have just finished, our company's just finished writing a course that is advanced practices in dementia, and also teaching medical practitioners how to evaluate and treat swallowing disorders in the dementia population.
So why is it swallowing? I mean, among other things. I mean, I'm trying to figure out a connection, because I don't think the public would understand what does dementia have to do with swallowing.
Yeah, it is kind of an interesting connection, but what patients a lot of times will have attention problems, so the environment, just like here in the studio, you have lights and cameras, and there's a lot of things going on, so the patient unable to really attend to the meal. And then lastly, they lose the sensory ability to sense the food in the mouth and the throat, and also the motor function in the throat to actually navigate the food into the esophagus correctly and safely.
Okay, so it's not just cognitive, but it affects all of the systems, including
it's sensory,
taste,
motor, and
sensory.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yep.
Right. You know, which obviously affects the swallowing.
But then we see that kind of snowball into catastrophic things for patients, because they commonly develop wounds because of poor nutrition, hydration, weight loss. So all that falls into that swallowing category in our dementia patients.
So is it dementia in general or Alzheimer's specific?
That's a good question. A lot of people don't. That's a question I get a lot from my patients. Is what's the difference in dementia and Alzheimer's? And I know you have a segment coming up soon on cancer, so I'll use that for an example. If we have cancer as an umbrella diagnosis, there's many different types that fall into that. If we think about dementia the same way, we have many different forms that fall under the dementia diagnosis. Alzheimer's is the most prevalent, with about 71% of the dementia cases are Alzheimer's disease. But not all dementias are progressive either, and that's something most people don't know either.
So we're like an Alzheimer's patient, you know that is progressive, and we know that the swallowing problems and the speech problems are all part of that at some point during their phase, but maybe not if they have vascular dementia.
Good point. So we can actually see swallowing disorders onset much earlier in a vascular dementia patient, because that's neurological deficits, or like a Parkinson's related dementias. But nearly 100% of your dementia patients do acquire swallowing disorders.
Oh, okay. So
during the course of the disease.
So is there any research done on this? I mean, we just heard from from Randy Bach about clinical research. So is there some research that's going on? Or some new things that helps your patients?
There is, yes, sir, there is. A lot of the research before really focused on looking at feeding tubes, and we know that feeding tubes are not at all a mode of treatment that gives us any kind of positive clinical outcome in this diagnosis.
Yeah.
So really, there's a lot of look and research into how do we deal with these patients, how do we keep them eating, how do we keep them hydrated, and the course that I mentioned earlier teaches medical practitioners exactly how to do that. So there's a lot of research out there to teach us to say how can we keep these patients eating, but also keep a level of quality of life during the course of the disease as well.
Mm-hmm. So it's about managing the illness then.
Exactly, symptom management.
Right.
Yep.
Now, you've already mentioned that we're going to have someone come on and talk about cancer and the genetic testing for that. Is there a genetic testing that you do with people in dementia?
Yes, and this is a great question because this is something I get in many lectures and from caregivers and siblings that their mom or dad have the disease. There is genetic testing to see if you have the gene, and the genetic testing is looking for a gene that's called the apolipoprotein number 4, and that's the one we mostly associate with Alzheimer's. But I'll say that it's if your mom has that gene and you get that, but your dad doesn't, you have a 3 times chance higher of developing Alzheimer's. If you get it from both your parents, it increases it 12 times. But we have recent studies, even one that published a couple months ago, that says even though you have the gene, it does not mean that you'll acquire the disease itself. It's not so much the gene, it's age, it's good cardiovascular health, sleep hygiene, good mental health, weight, and those types of things that are the causes and not necessarily having the gene itself.
So if I was interested in being tested, because it's my father, we think, had Alzheimer's when he passed,
Yes,
right?
ma'am.
So if I'm interested, would I want my mom tested too to see if she had the gene as well?
My advice would be, even if you get tested and you find out they have the gene, it kind of is what it is, right? You can't change your genetics.
Right.
So, but you can change lifestyle. You can change not only physical health, but also mental exercise and mental health and how you live. So even though that you have the gene, it does not mean that you'll actually acquire the condition. And that's a misconception across a lot of people that my parents have it, then I'm going to acquire it, and we know that through a lot of research that's not true.
So someone as old as Barbara, she still has she still has a chance.
Right, so I'm not going to comment on
to change her lifestyle.
You do, yes, ma'am. You absolutely do.
So what does that look? So people like me who are approaching 65. Okay, so what should I be doing?
Well, there's a lot of things you should be doing. Number one, we try to look at how your parents used to say you are what you eat, and that's true. So diet is one of the biggest things. We see the prevalence of Alzheimer's skyrocket in people with type 2 diabetes that are overweight and don't take care of themselves. Good sleep hygiene, keeping your mind very active, and so those things are certainly going to be a part of that, but also just physical exercise too.
Right.
So a lot of the diet, good sleep hygiene, and all the things that I mentioned are all things that we have been shown that we can actually now start to prevent the condition from onsetting and that apolipoprotein number 4 from mutating.
Any medications coming along that we need to be thinking?
There are some medications. The medications designed right now that are out on the market are there to improve cognition, but not slow down the disease. But we do have some medications in clinical trials that are showing that we can start to see some breakdown of those plaques and those tangles. But the downside to it, we don't see that it is actually slowing the disease process down.
Oh my goodness.
So really, prevention is a main focus for research in a lot of institutions.
Right.
What about, anyone comment on any supplements, like the nutrition supplements? We used to take vitamin E. We thought that would make a difference. Ginkgo, we thought would make a difference. And now we know it really doesn't.
No, ma'am. But there are things that, as long as you have good thyroid health, so whenever I see patients that have a dementia diagnosis, before we say that they have Alzheimer's or some kind of very strong word to use among patients, we want to rule out things like vitamin B12 insufficiency, hyper or hypothyroidism, toxicities, traumas, those types of things can also cause dementia symptoms. So really, good hormone, good vitamins and multivitamins and fish oil, those types of things are great.
Yeah.
So what are you telling patients maybe who have just gotten diagnosed? What are you telling them? What are you telling their families? What advice are you giving?
What I try to do is I try to take them through, there are 7 main stages of dementia, and I go in a stage and say, this is where we're at, this is what we can do, but this is what's coming next.
All right.
So they know. And
so stage 1 is?
Stage 1 is going to be more subjective cognitive impairment, more age-related.
Okay.
And then we go into stage 2, which is going to be more mild cognitive impairment, which is pre-dementia.
Okay.
Some of those turn into dementias, some of them don't.
Right.
And then we start to go into 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and that's going to be mild, moderate, severe, and profound.
Okay.
So is your company designed for end users like individuals, or is your company designed to be a support or augment to medical providers?
Both.
Okay.
So as I mentioned earlier, SpectrumMed just finished writing a course that is a very comprehensive course that teaches medical practitioners how to stage dementia, differential diagnose. We go into the genes and prevention, but also we go into the nutritional pieces, and teaches the medical practitioners how to treat dementia and also keeping the quality of life intact as long as possible for those patients. In my private practice, I actually do go into the home and evaluate the patients and treat within the home. So you don't see that very often, actually, in home treatments. But it's difficult for those patients to be able to go see a doctor and to be able to come out of their home. It's very taxing on them.
Right.
Yeah, it is. Well, I know we've got his contact information,
Right.
but any last words about how you want to what you want people to know?
I think that there's great resources out there. My suggestion is to, certainly look at the Alzheimer's org. They keep the most current statistics and those types of things. But always ask your primary care physician questions. Be an advocate and be an advocate for your care. And also, when there is a diagnosis, to be able to accept it as much as possible and understand that this is something that is going to get worse. But how do we manage this through time? And it certainly will decrease the burden upon the caregiver as well.
Right. Because that's really often who it affects the most.
Yes, sir. We're seeing now that the patients are outliving their caregivers.
Yeah.
So they are a part of the treatment as well.
Gotcha. That's good.
Yeah, they have to be. And sometimes they just don't even realize how important that is. They think they can just do everything and they're not getting the respite or the support that they need.
And it's an incredible burden. So when I assess, and that's something that we're teaching in our course, is how to assess the caregiver and their caregiver burden.
Right.
So, yes.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
That's great information, David. It's time for another break. So next, in our next segment, we'll be talking about a tool for early detection of cancer. So stay with us.